My name is Marty Allen. I'm the Chairman Emeritus of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation. This is a very, very special night for Grand Rapids, for the Ford Museum, for the Ford Foundation, and with the deep appreciation to Grand Valley State University for their cooperation in this event. But we are celebrating, coming near the close of the 25th anniversary of the creation of the Gerald R. Ford Museum and its foundation. And our guest speaker was there in 1981. He also became a charter member of the foundation on that day in 1981. And as I've said so many times, when I've had this opportunity, in 1981, President Ford, when he made his remarks at the dedication of the museum, he made it very clear that he did not want the museum to be a monument to himself, that he wanted it to be a living, growing institution, an institution of living history, and it's been our mission to do that as a foundation and a museum. There is no doubt that if President Ford could be here tonight, he would be here. He wrote this letter. Excuse me. Dear Henry, it is with the deepest regret that I cannot be there to thank you for your participation and to thank you even more so for your wonderful and long-time friendship. I could go on and on because our friendship began when both of us were much younger. You were a professor at Harvard, and I went to the university to express the views as a member of the Congress. That's a long time ago, but the start of a wonderful friendship that is straightforward and one for both of us to benefit from and enjoy. I can only add that I am most grateful for you coming to Grand Rapids on behalf of the Ford Foundation. I'll be there in spirit, Henry. God bless and thank you. Jerry. At this time, I'd like to ask Elaine Didier to come up and introduce our speaker. Elaine?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special program sponsored by the Gerald Ford Foundation, the Ford Presidential Museum, and with thanks also to Grand Valley State University for hosting a visit by Dr. Kissinger on their campus late this afternoon. We're very delighted to have you with us this evening to hear our distinguished speaker. My name is Elaine Didier, and I have the privilege, and I say that very, very seriously, the privilege of serving as director of the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum. As those of you who are regular attendees at our programs know, this is the 25th anniversary year for both the Ford Library in Ann Arbor and the Ford Museum here in Grand Rapids. Groundbreaking for both buildings was in 1979 and both opened in 1981. We have had a stellar year of programs at both sites, hosting capacity crowds for Bob Woodward and Brent Scowcroft at the library, and Joseph Galloway and David Hume Kennerly here at the museum. Tonight's presentation by Dr. Kissinger is another in that series. We are greatly honored by Dr. Kissinger's willingness to fit us into his very busy schedule. While his resume is long and filled with outstanding accomplishment, let me assure you that he is not resting on his laurels, and scheduling him to visit is a non-trivial matter. As you may know, Dr. Kissinger was born in Germany, emigrated to the United States in 1938, served in the U.S. Army during World War II, and then earned 3 degrees from Harvard. From his earliest studies, he focused on history, philosophy, and diplomacy, winning top grades in the classroom and setting records for the length and depth of his undergraduate and doctoral dissertations. In fact, according to Wikipedia, there is now a Kissinger rule restricting the length of future senior theses. Dr. Kissinger was a member of the Harvard faculty for 17 years, during which he was a consultant on foreign policy to both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He was then named Assistant for National Security Affairs for President Nixon, after which he was named 56th Secretary of State and served under both President Nixon and President Ford. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. Since that time, Dr. Kissinger has authored multiple books, been a lecturer and consultant on foreign affairs, and he continues to use his expertise and insights to advise leaders here and abroad. These brief facts don't begin to chronicle the career and accomplishments of Dr. Kissinger. He has been a key advisor to multiple presidents of both parties and was involved in major issues such as China, the Middle East, the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, détente in the Soviet Union, repairing alliances with Japan and Europe, and many, many more. As C.Y. Lin noted in an article about Dr. Kissinger back in 1974, Henry Kissinger has become a household word, he said. His was the name that made foreign policy famous. When he was nominated to be Secretary of State, Newsweek magazine commented, "Was there anything he didn't do? Any role he didn't play? He was the White House genius in residence, reshaping American foreign policy and in so doing, restructuring world order." In summary, Dr. Kissinger has been a scholar, author, diplomat, consultant, and advisor, and now we are incredibly fortunate to have him here as our speaker tonight. Dr. Kissinger has agreed to take your questions following his remarks, and we have provided cards for you to write your questions. As you think of questions for him, please write them down and pass them to the aisles at any time. Members of our staff will collect them, and after Dr. Kissinger's presentation, I'll use the second podium to read them so that everyone can hear the questions. And now, would you please help me welcome former Secretary of State and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. Henry Kissinger.
Madam Chairman, Marty, ladies and gentlemen, when I heard that introduction, I found myself in the position in which I once was at a reception, where a lady came up to me and said, "I understand you're a fascinating man," she said. Fascinate me. It turned into one of the less successful conversations that I've had. It means a great deal to me to be permitted to come here on the 25th anniversary of a president whom I was honored to serve, and of a man who is one of the best friends I've ever had. President Ford came into office at one of the most tragic moments in American history. It was the first time a president resigned in office. It was the first time that the country had been torn apart since the Civil War on an impeachment proceeding. And that occurred after a near decade of the Vietnam tragedy and crisis. He took over a demoralized government, represented this country to an uncertain world, and he had not been elected to that office, the first time that that had occurred in American history. But he took over these responsibilities with the humanity, the serenity, and the matter-of-factness which characterized all of his conduct. He restored faith within the government. faith of the American people into the government and faith of the rest of the world in the possibility that America could fulfill its obligations. All of this was done with a calm and a, as I said, serenity that is very difficult to come by in anybody's life, and exceptionally rare amidst the pressures of Washington. It was a great honor to be able to work with him. And he remained my friend all the years since then. We have served on boards together. We talk on the telephone frequently. In fact, I talked to him last Sunday, which was not the best judgment I ever made when I called him, because he was watching a football game. And I regret to report this. He cut me off the phone fairly rapidly. So thank you, Marty, for giving me this opportunity. And let me talk to you about the problems of foreign policy as I see them now. You know, I came to this country nearly 70 years ago as a young boy. I had lived in a dictatorship, and I had seen what oppression could be like. And so, all during the periods of crises in which I served, I confess I sometimes was a little impatient with some of the critics, not of the content of what we did, which is what democracy is about, but the assault on fundamental American purposes. Because I saw in my life what America meant to people who were in the position in which I found myself. So you have to consider what I say, always influenced by the fact that I want America to stay strong in this world, and that I don't happily join discussions about how we could mitigate defeats. One may have to do that sometimes, but one has to look at it from the point of view of what I consider our necessities in this world. And it's from this point of view that I want to discuss some of the contemporary problems with you. And then in the question period, you can ask me about any aspect of it or anything that I didn't cover. And I've told Mrs. Didier not to screen out unfriendly questions, recognizing the fact that in Grand Rapids, I may not get all that many unfriendly questions. But so, for hospitality's sake, throw in a few unfriendly ones so that I feel that she's really not let me down by being too polite. Now, we've been, since as a country, since September 11th, 2001, we've been very conscious of the phenomenon of terrorism. And the phenomenon of terrorism isn't just violent acts for their own purpose, but they reflect a strategy by which radicals, mostly in the Islamic world, are trying to undermine confidence in the institutions of the societies that they object to. And those societies have ranged from Bali in Indonesia to Muslim countries like Tunisia, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, to European countries like Spain and England, and potentially affect countries like India that have very large Islamic populations. And I want to make clear, I'm not talking about the populations. I'm talking about the violent, radical elements among these populations. Now, in the course of this summer, we experienced a new phenomenon. We've been thinking of terrorists as people who hide in the population, emerge to do their violent acts, and then disappear again. But what happened this summer was that terrorists appeared not as hiding in the population, but as a state within a state. In Lebanon, and to some extent, a lesser extent in Iraq, they emerge as organized, visible groups. In the Hezbollah in Lebanon controls a specific territory. It participates in the government, but it isn't bound by the decisions of the government. It conducts wars against the wishes of the government where it is located, and imports arms on its own account. And all of this creates a new phenomenon of a state within a state. And that is of significance for the following reason. And let me be professorial for 5 minutes here. The international system that we are familiar with, that we sort of take for granted, really evolved only in the 17th century. After the religious wars in Europe, in which about 30% of the population of Central Europe died as a result of attempts to make people conform to religious preferences. The rulers of that period decided they needed a new system. And they developed what we now take for granted, the concept of the modern state. And that state was supposed to be sovereign within its own territory. And it was supposed to be free from interference in its domestic affairs by outside countries. Aggression was defined as the movement of military units across established borders of a sovereign state. And international law was developed, all of this from the 17th century on, in order to regulate how states should deal with each other. Now, all of this is under attack now because the terrorist groups, of course, don't think of themselves as terrorists. They think of themselves as representatives of a new order which is trying to overthrow the state system in the creation of which they, of course, had no role. But the basic issue is whether the state system can continue. And if the states start disintegrating, then on what is international order and international law to be based? That is the heart of the issue. And this is why when one talks of solving these problems, either the system of states can be resurrected, or we're going to be living in a world of extreme turmoil in which issues will be settled by force until something new emerges. Now, we don't recognize this fully because we live in an established state that has no real challenge. But even in Europe, the states that we knew are sort of weakening, and they're trying to find a new system called the European Union. But they're doing it by constitutional means and by the methods by which they grew up as nations. But that is not the situation in the Middle East. And so we live in a world in which there are really 3 or 4 different international systems are occurring simultaneously. As I said, in Europe, the nation state is weakening, and the dilemmas of Europe are that the nations are caught between their past, which they're trying to overcome, and their future in the European Union, which they haven't yet reached. And so they find it very difficult to make sacrifices in case of domestic reform, where they all know what is needed, but they cannot bring themselves to make sacrifices for a future that they cannot yet fully define. But in Asia, we have countries that still act like the European states did in the 19th century. They still think of each other as potential rivals. But with those countries, we have some practical problems, but no conceptual problems. It's in the Middle East that the conflicts are conducted like they were in Europe during the religious wars, and where the state boundaries are not taken very seriously because many of them were only established after World War I. There was no Iraq or Jordan, or for that matter Saudi Arabia, until 1920. They all emerged out of World War I, and not out of a history like America or Europe. And therefore, these terrorist groups, or whatever you want to call them, have a special power in those regions. Now, all of this is made even more difficult when you look at weapons of mass destruction. Until the discovery of weapons of mass destruction. Wars could be terrible, but there was still some relationship between the sacrifice of a war and the purpose of a conflict. But when you look at a war that can cause tens of millions of casualties, you have to ask yourself what the purpose of political life is. I can tell you from my personal experience, I was one of the 3 or 4 people who would be asked if nuclear war were ever considered by a president, including, of course, President Ford when he was president. We never reached that point. But you have to consider the weight, especially on the president, who knows that if he's ever asked to make that decision, tens of millions of people could be killed in a matter of days. And then you can say, of course, nobody should ever do that. But if you do that, if you say that, you turn the world over to the most brutal, genocidal, ruthless rulers threatening you with these weapons. Now, we in the administrations in which I served, but all other American administrations of both parties, managed to navigate this problem in the Cold War because we were up against only one adversary. And that adversary, with all his shortcomings and, as it turned out, weaknesses, had a somewhat similar interpretation of the balance between risks and goals. But that was a two-power world. So now we are facing countries like Korea and Iran. Korea is a almost incomprehensible country in a place like Grand Rapids. The population has been so undernourished for the whole period of communist rule there that today you can tell the difference between North Koreans and South Koreans by their height, and not just occasionally, but as a standard feature. It's a country in which every house has a radio that they cannot shut off, so that the government is in a position to talk to the population every minute of the day and night. It's a country in which hundreds of thousands have starved to death, and in which the diplomats are not getting a salary, but have to support themselves by counterfeiting and any other illicit trade they can come up with. Well, such a country having nuclear weapons is a menace to the whole world. And Iran has its own version of fanaticism. It's a more advanced country than North Korea, but an extraordinarily fanatical country, and now ruled by a president of extreme aggressiveness. Now, therefore, the spread of nuclear weapons, it's not an American project. It's a project that affects the whole world. And more than that, We are now in a position in which, with respect to Korea, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Japan, have made certain demands to end the nuclear program. With respect to Iran, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, of course including us, plus Germany, have made the same demands on Iran. Those are the major nations in the world. Now, if nothing happens, and if things continue unchecked, what is going to keep any other nation from going the same route? And what will happen in a world in which 30 or 40 countries have nuclear weapons, some of them having already demonstrated genocidal tendencies, and few of them having the capacity to safeguard them and to establish warning systems of the sophisticated kind that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union? That is the challenge of the nuclear issue. Now then there's a debate, whom should we negotiate with? Let me separate this in 2 parts. Let me take Korea first. From the point of view of security, Japan, China, South Korea, and even Russia are far more immediately threatened than the United States. And therefore, it would be senseless for the United States to say, we will conduct this as a separate negotiation between us and North Korea, when we are in a position that the other 5 nations substantially agree with us. So far, North Korea has refused to negotiate. Once it negotiates, I have no doubt that we will take part in the 6-power group, and within the 6 powers, we will of course find opportunities to talk to Korea. But the public debate that we should split this thing off and make it a separate American effort makes no sense to me. Now, Iran is more complex in the sense that we have a long history of friendly relations with Iran as a nation, including the Ford administration. And Iran, as a nation, is an important feature of the Middle East. So with Iran, it would be theoretically possible to conduct negotiations with the 5 plus separately. But we have to understand what the framework is. The challenge that Iran represents now is it a nation or is it a cause? If it's a nation, we can find a dialogue. It won't be easy, but one can conceive how it will evolve. If it is a cause, if Iran looks at the world and says, we have many benefits here that work in our direction. We have a potential vacuum in Iraq. We have the possibility of uniting the Shiite and Sunni people, groups, by attacking America and Israel. We can try to split Europe from America. if that's their policy, then it will be very difficult to have a negotiation either with the six or with us. And that's the real challenge we face. So we have a huge series of issues before us. And then, of course, we're all concerned about Iraq. And let me simply state what some of the issues are with respect to Iraq. It's not something which you can simply express in one sentence or with a belief that there is one formula to solve it. There are a number of trends occurring simultaneously. There is the insurrection in the Sunni regions against mostly the American presence. And this presents the classic dilemma of a guerrilla war, that a guerrilla usually wins if it doesn't lose, while the defender has to win or he loses. This is one problem. Second problem is that Iraq has never been a nation before 1920. Before 1920, it was governed as part of the Ottoman Empire in three regions: a Kurdish region, a Sunni, in effect a Sunni region, and a Shiite region, by different governors. The third is that these various, and the Kurdish region, that these various groups have an enormous sense of their identity. And the fourth is that they're split among each other, within each other. So that last weekend you had a battle between two Shiite groups in the southern part of Iraq. So a solution will have to have a military component, a political component, and something that has not yet been really addressed, an international component. Because whatever emerges in Iraq will have to get some sort of international recognition. Now, I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I have the answer to all of these issues. But I do say that we as a nation will have to consider the consequences of unwise decisions, because this is not a problem that will end locally. Because as I said earlier, the people who are contributing or producing this turmoil have a global perspective so that the consequences will spread. Now, the main point I want to make here is, after our election, we're going to need a serious national debate on where we should go in this respect. And I am sure that the administration is going to make a major contribution to this, as will others, like various commissions. And this gets me back to where I started. I've by now lived so long that history repeats itself in my own lifetime. I've seen some of these debates when I was responsible for part of the management of the crisis. And now some of the same debates are starting again. And the major thought I want to leave you with is President Ford made many important contributions, but there's no contribution he made that was more important than the fact that he enabled Americans to trust each other again. And that whatever the disagreements were, I never heard him say a malicious word about his opponents. And amazingly, given the mood in Washington, I can't think of any malicious words that were said about him as a person. So this is the spirit that I hope will animate us. We're in a period of great complexity. But it's also a period in which unbelievable changes have taken place. When I first came to China in 1971, if anyone had described to me what China looks like today, I would have thought they were mad. So you have China and India emerging as major features. You have Japan returning into a more national direction. You have a global economic system, but a national political system. So we have huge tasks before us. And on the whole, the opportunities for creating a world order are as great than the dangers, and we have to make them greater. I have a Chinese acquaintance who claims that it's the following Chinese proverb. I say claims because I'm not sure there are as many proverbs as they tell us. I think they make them up as they go along. But that proverb is supposed to go like this. When there is turmoil under the heavens, little problems are dealt as if they were big problems. And big problems are dealt with at all. When there is order under the heavens, big problems are reduced to little problems. And little problems should not obsess us. That's the real challenge of our period. And that's what we should keep in mind when we go through the headlines of the day. That the world is in change. That you cannot fix everything at the same time, but you can move it in a beneficial direction. And let me close this with a word of Winston Churchill. He once said, sometimes it isn't enough to do your best. It's crucial to do what's necessary. And that's what we face today. That's what I've tried to describe to you. And that's what President Ford did when he took over as President of the United States in a crisis, unexpectedly, and under circumstances which seemed extremely difficult then too. So let me stop here and take some questions. Thank you very much.
If you have more questions, feel free to note them and pass them to our staff, and we'll handle as many as Dr. Kissinger will indulge. We have some historical ones that are quite interesting, but I'll start with a couple of current ones. Thank you. What is your assessment of the current state of our relationship with Russia? Has our interest in fostering freedom there turned President Putin against us?
That's a very good question. In order to assess Russian policy, one has to look at Russian history. Here is a country whose defining characteristic through most of its history has been a kind of imperialism. Russia, at all times in its history since the 17th century, has been expanding in all directions, into Europe, into Asia, into Central Asia. Its imperialism was towards neighboring countries, not towards distant colonies, like the European, that of the European nations. And so it has this strange phenomenon that it has never defined itself by domestic achievements, but it has translated its foreign efforts into domestic achievements. So this has now come to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russia now is back to where it started under Peter the Great at the beginning of the 18th century. And Russia now faces the challenge of finding a domestic mode of action in its own construction. But that requires a re-education, in many respects, of fundamental Russian attitudes. And it's always easier for the leaders to mobilize public attitudes along familiar lines towards Ukraine, towards Georgia, towards the territories that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now, the instinctive reaction of Russia has always been to have a strong central government, and even more than a strong central government, a strong leader. And throughout Russian history, even when Stalin was murdering tens of millions of people, the public belief was usually that the top leader was relatively benign, and that if anything went wrong, it must have been done by his subordinates. This is the history in which most Russians grew up. Now Putin, who is vilified in our press, is extremely popular in Russia. All public opinion polls show that he has an approval rating of about 74%. And while he pretty well controls the television, the newspapers are relatively free. So one can read country reviews to Putin. It is probably true that he interprets some of American actions, both in Ukraine and Georgia and towards Russia, as an attempt to weaken the way he governs. And I think it is probably true that this has led, as the questioner implies, to a worsening of relations. Some of this was perhaps unavoidable, some of it perhaps avoidable. But I think the question is well put, and I would agree as a factual analysis that it has a lot of merit.
Okay. Here's one about the United Nations. Has the UN outlived its usefulness, or was it ever useful? If so, when and how?
The UN represents about 190 sovereign countries. When it started, it had about 50 countries in 1945. So it has undergone enormous changes. These countries in the General Assembly vote as nations. And sometimes they cannot be instructed properly. For example, I can give you an example from my personal experience. We conducted a negotiation while I was in office about deep sea mining, how to put it under some sort of internet, give a lot of nations access to some of the results while having special benefits for the nations or groups of nations that could actually do the mining. Leaving aside the merit of that dispute, there was one representative from a developing country, a very small developing country, that had no coastline, so it wasn't even, who made himself a tremendous expert on the subject, and secondly, made our life hell in the negotiation. And so I went to his government to see why they were doing this. And it turned out the government did not have the foggiest idea about deep sea mining, and that he was doing this on his own. Now, as a general proposition, I would say this. There are a number of things in which the United Nations can do a very good job. For example, refugees, disaster relief, technical subjects which do not involve disagreement among the great powers. The United Nations also has done good work when the big powers have agreed on settling a dispute in supplying forces that can check an agreement to which both sides have agreed. What the United Nations has never done well is, instead of peacekeeping, contributing to peacemaking. That is, introducing forces that would actually change the attitudes of parties. They have not been able to do it in the Security Council unless the permanent members agree, and they haven't been able to do it on the ground. And we will soon see this tested in Lebanon, because we have introduced, or the UN has introduced, peacekeeping forces into southern Lebanon. But in order to do it by United Nations principles, they have to do it with the approval of the host country. But the government of the host country, namely Lebanon, is weaker than Hezbollah. So the host country has no power with respect to Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah manages to take over the local government, the peacekeeping force will be operating in a vacuum. So right now, when things are settling down, that force is doing, I suppose, a reasonable job. But if rearmament were to start again, and if a conflict developed, we would see what can be done. So I think on the peacemaking aspect, the United Nations has not been effective at all. In addition to the things that I've mentioned, it provides a forum where it is easy to start a dialogue with countries where it is otherwise more complicated. But it is not what is often described in some of the more well-meaning papers, a force which can act as an international government. It has never come close to that.
Okay. What sort of role have you played in advising the current administration on foreign policy concerns, specifically the war on terror?
What role? Who?
What role have you played in advising the current Bush administration on foreign policy issues such as the war in terror? You. Mm-hmm. Thou.
Look, I have taken the position that I will not talk about conversations I have with the president. Anybody who had seen presidents in action knows that they must have the possibility to call in some people for personal discussions, put up their feet, and not worry how this will play in the press. In my life, I have been available to help presidents in every administration from Kennedy on. I have never talked about my private conversations with presidents, or whether they agreed with me or disagreed with me. But with respect to the war on terror, there have been some allegations made of what I recommend. Now, you can assume that what I say privately is not different from what I have written. And so anybody can go to the internet. I've written 9 articles on Iraq over the last years. And you can read for yourself what I think about it, and not accept the characterizations that journalists may make in their books and otherwise. I mean, I have a public record on many of these issues, and so you can determine for yourself what I'm likely to be saying.
Okay. Looking back on your lifetime, what are some key lessons you have learned about the nature and practice of diplomacy?
I would say these are all very good questions.
And there are more.
You know, when I read discussions on diplomacy, the argument is often made, why don't we just get people around a table and then they'll solve the problem. But that is not how diplomacy works. Because when people get around the table, there are several components. But they are influenced by their fundamental concepts. And so a diplomatic negotiation depends on a balance between incentives and penalties. When you tell a nation you want it to do something that it hasn't already done, you're trying to affect its calculations. Now, those calculations depend on its general national purpose. So I believe that the first thing you have to do when you want to negotiate is to get clear about what you are trying to achieve. The second is you have to understand what the other side is trying to achieve. What I always try to do in my negotiations, or in negotiations in which I was involved, is to begin the dialogue by telling the other side pretty precisely what I was aiming at, because that could then help it understand my specific proposals. And I invited them to tell me what they were aiming at. Then you have to see whether some consensus can emerge. But what you mustn't do is to talk yourself into the frame of mind that says, when there's a deadlock, you always have to make a new proposal. Because when you take that attitude, then the other side in a negotiation has every incentive to produce a deadlock, to see what the next compromise proposal is going to be. And there are sort of two attitudes towards negotiations. And I'm not saying which is better, I'm just telling you how one tends to approach it. You can either say, let's start with your maximum position, and then do it like slicing a salami, make a little proposal and see what happens along the way. That's one approach. That's in fact what I would say the majority of negotiators do. The trouble with that approach is that the other side never knows when the end of the salami slicing has happened, and they may keep waiting for the next slice. The other approach, which I prefer, is to get as clear as possible about what is a reasonable objective and on which you should want to settle. And to keep in mind that no international agreement will be kept if the other side doesn't have an interest in keeping it. So to put forward a maximum position is good for publicity, but it doesn't usually get you very far. So my view has always been to put forward as close to your final position right away, and just leave a little room for adjustments for the dignity of the other side. But that's a question of negotiating technique. And you'll probably find people at business schools who'll tell you the opposite is a better approach. But anyway, these are some of the lessons
Good.
that I would apply.
We'll close with a question about advice for young people who have an interest in the Foreign Service and a career in diplomacy. What guidance would you give them? What lessons?
Well, I think it's a tremendous career, and to represent your country towards the rest of the world is a great honor and a great challenge. In my view, the best preparation for it is to read as much history as you can, because, of course, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. But history it teaches not, you can't use it like a cookbook, but you can use it by analogy, by trying to discover what type of situation has happened before, and to learn as much as you can about the characteristics of other countries. Foreign service is a demanding career because not every post is agreeable. But those who manage to stay in, and once they get to the higher ranks, it is a great way to serve your country. And when you're Secretary of State, you have this problem with the Foreign Service. Foreign Service is a group of very able individuals, but they've been abroad a lot, and they've developed a certain amount of self-will. So many of them think that the Secretary of State probably couldn't have passed the Foreign Service exam. So if you overrule them, they think you haven't understood them. And they keep coming back at you in various variations. But if you're strong, they're a terrific group, and they perform great service. And I always urge young people who have that inclination that it's a very fulfilling career. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming tonight. This was as wonderful as we thought it would be. Dr. Kissinger, we're so honored to have you. I know President Ford would have loved to be with us tonight. And now I know there's another subject aside from international relations that's on your minds. Go Tigers. Thank you for coming.